We're continuing on with our apologetics discussions today, talking about postmodernism and religious pluralism. Now, let me give you first an idea just what we mean by that. And the concept of this goes with both. If you have a response from someone, a framework, something like, well, you believe what you believe, I'll believe what I believe, and as long as both of us are happy in our religion, as long as both of us are happy in our viewpoint, that's okay. As long as both of us agree to get along and we like our viewpoint, everything will be fine. And it's, in that case, a dismissal of a careful pursuit of truth. How do we know what's true? And why then is it critical for us to pursue that and find and know the truth? I'm going to start off with postmodernism a bit later, then we'll move into the religious expression of that. Postmodernism would be more in the general umbrella secular format, and religious pluralism specifically in relation to faith. But let's start off with postmodernism and recognize that even if you've never heard the term, or even if you couldn't give a definition of the term, what is postmodernism? You are being affected by it. It is already part of your life. And the reason I can say that, all of us are deeply affected by postmodernism because it's in the air we breathe. Okay, a friend of mine referred to this or compared this to secondhand smoke. I'm not a smoker. I've never smoked in my life. But if I hang out with people that smoke, I can be affected. And there are statistical studies to recognize children that grow up in homes where their parents are regular smokers. The children are going to be affected very adversely, in the same kind of way that a smoker would be. Because even though they don't smoke, when other people do, that drifts through. And so we recognize, even if I reject postmodernism as a philosophy, or even if you don't know what postmodernism is, it's still all around you all the time. And so you're going to hear it in media, you're going to hear it in TV, and in writing, and in blog posts, and just in conversations. People are going to say things, and those things are going to get into your head, and it is going to affect the way you process information. Well, before we then can discuss it further, we need to know what it is. And so let me give you a definition of postmodernism. In terms of history, there was, roughly speaking, a philosophical period or a philosophical concern called modernism, and an era in which there was I would say, unwarranted confidence that if we could just get our methods right, figure out the truth methods. Okay, here are the rules, here's the logic, here's how we process information. And if we can just get the right methods down, then we'll have truth just by having the right methods. And that confidence then is we can kind of create a truth machine or something. And just by processing those methods, here, the results are truth. And clear, absolute, defined truth. Settled, we're done, end of discussion. Reacting to that, and I think rightly so, postmodernism, the next stage after, recognizes that even as I'm thinking or I'm evaluating or as I'm looking at information, and let's say all the evidence comes out and it's set in front of me on a table and I'm supposed to evaluate the evidence, the truth is I bring my own perspective to the table. In my case, I bring the perspective of a middle-aged white male with an American background, having lived now in the Philippines. That's the perspective that I bring to it. And together with that, I'm going to bring a Christian lens to it. I'm going to bring a lens to it from the standpoint of the education and all of the other other influences I had in my life, my parents, my church, my friends, my wife. All of those influences around me shape my thinking so that it's not as though I can just respond to the information in front of me in a distant, removed, objective sort of way. I'm bringing my perspective to the information. And when you look at the information, you also bring your perspective to the information. And Each one of us will look at the information in different ways, so that now what we have to imagine is the information is on the table, but we're all seated around the table, and all of us see it from a completely different vantage point. And yes, we might come to very different conclusions. Postmodernism responds to that dilemma and says, well, in terms of knowing what is the truth, like the truth, the absolute truth, forget it. All you have is your perspective, and that's okay. I'll give my perspective, you give your perspective, she and her and everyone else, they give their perspectives, and when we're done, we had a conversation, and we move on. But there is no way within the framework of postmodernism to establish truth. This is it, that's true, that's false, we're done. In fact, in the more even recent developments of postmodernism and the thinking that has developed further with it, what is referred to as critical theory, another element comes into this, which is every conversation is really about asymmetries of power. One person sitting on one side of the table, maybe from a position of privilege and influence and wealth and education or whatever else, and a position of elitism, will push their agenda versus another person who tries to push their agenda and another person who pushes their viewpoint. And really what we're talking about is oppression, the person with the most power pushing down all of the other viewpoints. And that then becomes a critical part of thinking about the world and thinking about truth. In order to explain this further, let me show you some examples of this. I'm just going to give you a couple of statements, and these would be more or less typical postmodern statements, or they reflect something about postmodernism in them. So first of all, I wrote this: each of us has our own viewpoints, and that's okay for you, but you can't claim that any one viewpoint is absolute truth. I have my view, she has her view, he has his view, and we all throw our views out, and they're all equally valid. If you're true to yourself, that's a fine view. We don't need to even concern ourselves with which is the true and the false view. Second statement: all claims are really about power or getting what people want. Truth only exists within your small community of the people that agree with you. But there is no absolute, authoritative, I could add the word universal, and public truth. If you ask something like, what is the truth? Someone might say, well, which truth? Say, no, the truth, like the truth, the absolute for everybody truth. The answer is, oh, that doesn't exist. I have mine, you have yours, and we just have a conversation, and we leave it there. This third, actually, I didn't write this. This came from a personal conversation, and someone said this, and it made me laugh. But as I processed it a little bit, there's a postmodern element in this, a strongly postmodern element in it. I'm suspicious of anyone that is very passionate about anything. I resonate with some of that. I mean, I do. There's something in this. As someone who is so ideological that they're just screaming about their viewpoint makes you question, have they really maintained the controls to keep themselves balanced? Probably not. At the same time, the implication of that is that there's nothing worth being passionate about. And I would argue that life is very much worthy of being passionate. I'm very passionate about the realities of life and death and eternity. Why? Fact, I'm going to die. And fact, something after death matters to me very greatly. Even if you're going to say it's nothing, I just don't exist anymore. I want to know that. I want to know what happens to me after death. Well, I'm quite passionate about that reality. Here are a couple of other statements. These are popular culture statements, and I would encourage you maybe, after hearing this lecture, take some time, look about you, think and listen to advertising, or anyway, you probably encounter enough of it in your life regardless. And just as you see things, as you see signs, I've started paying attention and noticing where this pops up. And it's all around us. Statements like this. You're saying something that is true to you, but not applicable to me. Do you see the postmodern element of this? Something that is true to you, In other words, the question is not just truth, externally, objectively, publicly, universally, but it's true in respect to you, your truth. But it's not applicable to me, meaning it's not my truth. Another form of this, your view might be wrong, my view might be wrong, but hey, there are other views that also might be wrong, so it's fine as long as we're all good. And all good is just a bit of an Americanism, an expression, say as long as we have an okay relationship, as long as we're okay with each other. But here the concern moves from whether it's true or not to just say, well, I can't do anything anyway, there's no way I can find it, whether it's true or not, no way to establish it, so I give up. And since I give up, let's just be okay with each other. A third, that's a nice perspective, I can add that to my list. This is a bit of a passive-aggressive attack, because someone gives their viewpoint, they maybe make their case, and so the reaction is to it, okay, you're just giving a perspective, but I'm not going to grant to you truth. I'll just add you to the list of all of the other perspectives. And it's actually saying it's a nice perspective. It's actually nullifying the perspective to say, well, it's just a viewpoint. This is taken from a video game, and it's a slogan as part of the game. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. And I'll get to this argument a bit later, but one of the questions that always comes up, nothing is true. Is this statement true? Is the statement everything is permitted, is that true? Because if this statement right here, everything permitted, is true, that tells me this statement isn't true. We get into a philosophical conundrum called the liar's paradox. But in any case, it's impossible to say nothing is true. How then do we process postmodernism, or how do we react to postmodernism? A couple of evaluations. First, I'd like us just to acknowledge or recognize at the outset, postmodernism seems to be intellectually humble. It seems to be tolerant of other viewpoints, and it accomplishes that by not being dogmatic about anything. So one of the notions of postmodernism, you can't strongly say anything particularly, we just give our viewpoints and that kind of thing. And so in a way, it offers itself, or it commends itself for its intellectual humility. Well, I can't really know or say that anything is absolute truth. I'm always going to learn, I'm always going to question, I'm always going to struggle through and consider that maybe that viewpoint's not true after all. That sounds appealing as an intellectually humble viewpoint. It also has an appeal to say, well, I accept everyone. I accept all the viewpoints, I listen to all of them, and I appreciate all of them for their own sake. Again, a kind of an appeal to it. The reality, though, is that it is quite dogmatic. It's quite dogmatic simply because it moves, it only transfers the dogmatism to another place. Okay, another way of saying this, someone proposes, oh, well, I accept all viewpoints, but I accept no viewpoints as absolute. I think all viewpoints are fine enough. They're all different viewpoints in their own way. And there's an illustration often given of 3 blind men or 4 blind men that encounter an elephant. And they go to the elephant and one says, I think all truth is, and he feels, it's like a rope. Well, that's because he's got a hold of the elephant's tail. And the other man says, I think truth is, it's like a tree, and it's because he has a hold of the elephant's leg. And another person says, I think truth is something like a thick vine, and it's because he has the elephant's trunk. And another person says, I think it's like a wall because he's pushing on the side of the elephant. Okay, and so each blind man has his own viewpoint, and the answer is, an elephant is like all of those things. None of them are right, none of them are wrong. They all have a certain kind of truth to them. That would be a typical sort of postmodern parable, a way of expressing it. But do you know what the problem is in that parable? The problem is that the postmodern, the person who tells the story of the parable, he alone, he only is the one who can see the elephant. In other words, it assumes the viewpoint of the person sitting back and looking, and I know what an elephant is. I can see the whole picture, and I can tell you that all of you guys are only grasping part of the picture, except for me, who has the whole picture. And an underlying assumption then of postmodernism is that I have found the umbrella viewpoint. Okay, we can accept Christianity for some things, but it's not the absolute truth. And Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism, each one of them we can accept as having a certain kind of truth to it. And so we let everyone have their say, and we have the conversation, and when we get done we say, those are all really good viewpoints. But the assumption of the person proposing this viewpoint is that he has given the end all, the final viewpoint is accept all other viewpoints. And that viewpoint, accept all other viewpoints, is not a viewpoint that's up for consideration. That one is true. That one is fact. In fact, ironically, that one is final. And ironically, true postmodernism becomes deeply intolerant because it requires everyone else to give up actually believing their view. All of us have to become postmoderns and accept everyone else's view without actually seriously believing our own. And to that I say this is a highly intolerant viewpoint. Let's take a break for a second, and I will return to evaluation of postmodernism. But let's take a break and think for a moment or two about a biblical evaluation of it. And I'll start out with this. There is a certain kind of biblical truth at the core of postmodernism. I can think of two different respects in which there is a type of biblical truth. And one of them is this. Scripture affirms and agrees that in terms of knowing truth, you're not going to finally and fully settle truth in the sense that I have understood the world and we're done. And I could just say it in ways like this. There are other passages we could go to, but I'll take you to Ecclesiastes as one expression of this. Ecclesiastes will affirm, God has put eternity in their hearts. The word translated the world here, I would actually translate that eternity. He has set eternity in their hearts so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. I'll continue down, I'll skip a few of the passages here, but here, Ecclesiastes 8:17, I beheld all the work of God, a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Though a wise man thinks to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. And what I said earlier about postmodernism commending itself in some ways because it affirms that no one has the absolute and final, I have figured out truth, we're done kind of authority. Well, in that sense, yes, I don't. And yes, I do need to learn the rest of my life. And yes, I recognize and have to recognize that in so many ways I might be wrong about this or that or many things. We're going to talk in a moment. Denying that there can be any absolute truth is a different question. But here, okay, there's a certain insight to that. That none of us have the absolute finished, we've figured out the world. None of us, if we claim to have figured out the world, or if we claim to be wise, we've only demonstrated our folly. Another insight of postmodernism that's legitimate is to recognize that instead of, like in a modernistic framework, thinking, okay, truth just happens and human beings are truth machines, as though we can just kind of calculate truth the way that a computer runs through a program. Postmodernism observes that what's actually going on has more to do with our values, our agendas, what we want to be true. And there's a biblical insight in that. Passages like this, John 3, this is the judgment. Light has come into the world. People love darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. Okay, the truth has come, the light, truth. But people reject truth. And the reason they reject truth is their works. Everyone who does wicked things hates the light. He doesn't come to the light lest his work should be exposed. Whoever does what is true comes to the light, that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. And the rich insight of that is to say, people rejected Jesus, people reject truth, because at the core, their hearts and their wills and their desires conflict with the truth. We are not just truth machines. We are hearts and emotions and choices. John 7 continues this idea. If any man will do his will, you could translate it, is willing to do God's will, he will know of the doctrine whether it is of God. In other words, the question of knowing is actually a deeper question. It's a question of willing. Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. This word right here, it is often translated suppress, hold down, push away. No, I don't know. No, reject and refuse to listen. But if you watch it, it's not because they don't have the truth, it's because they don't want the truth. And you see that just a few verses later. Though they knew God, they rejected him. They knew the truth. They don't want to hear it. So there are rich insights in that, biblical notions that in some way fit. We can go further with this. We can explain the concerns of postmodernism from the biblical story. And by that, what I mean is, why is it so hard to know what is true? Why do we get so confused, or why is truth so debated? I mean, why can't we just walk around the world and just oh, that's true, settled? Why is it so complicated? Why do people manipulate truth and deceive? And the answer is because the fall has corrupted us. Not only physically, we die. Not only our choices, we sin, but also what's sometimes called the noetic effects of the fall, the way we think. And therefore, sin infects every part, including our brains, and our salvation requires restoration of everything about us. But I'm going to move now from biblical evaluation, and what I gave there was kind of, in a sense, acknowledging that there are some insights here. I'm going to move now to critique and some of the answers we ought to give if you're having a conversation with someone from the perspective of postmodernism. And a couple of things here. One, at the core, postmodernism is actually impossible. I alluded to this earlier when I gave this quote from Assassin's Creed. There is no truth. Everything is permitted. There is no truth. Wait, but you kept on talking. And even if you hadn't, even if all you had was just the first statement, there is no truth, that was a truth claim. And in your truth claim, you said there is no such thing as a truth claim, except you made a truth claim in order to say that. And so I end up in this impossible situation. If there are no truth claims, I shouldn't be listening to your words. I shouldn't be taking them seriously. If there are truth claims, then your words aren't true. And in either case, if what we're saying is, well, everyone has their perspective, none of them are actually any true than any others, why does the postmodernist get to tell me what is absolutely universally true for everybody? How can I absolutely prove, absolutely, publicly, universally prove that there are no absolutes? There is nothing that is universally and publicly true. If truth cannot be known, how can you know that fact? And so anyway, in any case, you find the concept just swinging around and eating it, a snake eating its own tail. It destroys itself. It's self-stultifying. It is impossible to be true if it is true. And as a result of that, what you discover then, even practically speaking, is that a postmodern, someone you're having this kind of conversation with, will slip in and out of using postmodernism, but then switching back to using foundationalism, the idea that there is truth. They'll slip between the two. In other words, postmoderns will write books. But why should they write books if there can't be truth? You apparently think that this book grasps at something. You think it points towards something, but if it doesn't point to anything at all that's meaningful and true, why write it down? Why have a discussion with me? Why care what I think? If in fact none of us can have truth. If it's just you have your truth and I have mine, then go be a postmodern, have your truth, and don't care what I think. But you discover that postmoderns want to convince you. Even though from the other side of their mouth, they'll say that every one of us just have our own viewpoint. How can we understand what a postmodern means when they talk, unless language does mean something? How can we evaluate the truth of postmodernism itself if there is no truth? And in fact, we recognize rather no human beings are made to think about truth, and we cannot stop thinking about truth. As much as someone says, I don't believe in the concept of an absolute truth, they believe what they just said. In our DNA, no, in our nature, in the way we're created, at the core of who we are, at the essence of our beings, we are truth appreciators. We do have in our natures a concept of truth and error. Sometimes, and ironically, especially in the West, people will say that this sort of idea, that there's a one single absolute truth, that this is just the assumption of Western logic. I would respond to that in a couple of ways. One, a lot of the people that are talking that way have not left the West. So before you can say, oh, well, this is just our Western viewpoint, that we say there is an absolute truth and this is it. But in other parts of the world, they accept multiple viewpoints. You might want to talk to some of those people, and you would discover that people around the world, all around the world, have some idea in their heads that certain things are true and certain things are not. That's a universal human notion. And just to demonstrate that, if we want to give a couple of examples, an example that occurs to my mind, even if someone says, oh, I accept all true viewpoints, there is no absolute truth. If you commit something against them, I use the example sometimes of eating at a restaurant, finishing your meal, getting up, walking out the door without paying, you're going to quickly discover that the owner of the restaurant believes strongly in truth. I have a friend, and this is the reason this occurred to me, is he's the owner of a restaurant. And as I'm eating his food at his restaurant, and we're talking and having a good, amicable conversation, he's arguing that, no, there is no absolute truth. We all just have our own viewpoints. But he still expected me to pay. And that's an assumption that there is underneath it an absolute reality that is, in fact, true. I'm going to move from postmodernism. I'm going to move into the religious expression of this. So postmodernism is like the philosophical view. I'm moving from the philosophical side to the religious side. And so now I'm going to talk about the religious expression of postmodernism. And this would come up in even some forms that are actually stated as stated religions. Very often Buddhism and Hinduism will have this kind of bent to them. The notion of religious pluralism is that all religious views are just different ways of going to the same God. Okay, so all we've done is we've taken postmodernism, everybody has their view, and all of reality is just different views. There is no absolute one. And we've transferred that to God, and we've said there is no single God, as in God is like this. It's just lots of different gods, and we get to him, or it's lots of ways to get to the same God. As that, I'll just give a couple of examples. Here's an example of a progressive historian. And he just asked a question like this, and this is a common illustration that people use. You may have had someone say this kind of thing to you, even in a witnessing type of interaction. He just asks, which religion would we know is the right one? And his illustration goes, well, let's imagine that we are all in different ships and we're sailing to the same shore. And so we all travel out different ways. One person is in kind of like a Christian method of getting there, and the other person in a Buddhist, and another person in a Muslim way of getting to the shore. And we all set out in these different ships. When we arrive at the shore, it's the same shore. Another example or illustration that works the same way, will people use the picture of everyone climbing a mountain. God is at the top. And so if we all use different paths, you will go up the north side, I go up the south side, and someone east and west. We're all climbing the same mountain. We all arrive. When we get there at the top, it's the same God. And so Allah and Buddha and Jehovah, they're all the same God in the end. Now, as I process that, or as we process that out, you'll discover this is a very common strategy for people to use when they're in a context of a lot of religions existing together. And that's the reality that you have to get along. You know, if you have, let's say, a diverse society, lots of different religions functioning together, how will they all fit? How will they all work together? And so religious pluralism becomes a governmental solution or a cultural solution so that the religions don't destroy one another. We'll all just coexist. And therefore, as an underlying idea, we assume that all religions are just leading us to the same God. And there's an appeal to this. I gave biblical evaluation earlier with postmodernism, and I pointed out a couple of things. Well, there's concepts like this that someone can use. People will misuse Matthew 7, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. With what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. And the notion goes, instead of being judgmental and saying Islam is wrong, we should just accept Islam as it stands. Let's think about it a little bit. And I'll give some biblical foundations, what I would view as core notions that Scripture makes quite clear in respect to religious pluralism. Here are three. God is a jealous God. God does not allow for lots of different views that are all right in their own way. You can look at these references, or if you read through the Pentateuch, and I've just finished moving through from Genesis, and I'm in the middle of Deuteronomy, and it's constant. The other gods are false. Yahweh says, I am the true God. How do you know who is the true God, or what makes him the true God? And the answer is, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, that God. I am Jehovah, that God. I am the God who has spoken to you in this book, that God. And much later, Isaiah is going to do a similar thing. The God who speaks to you like this. I am the true God. The other gods are false. Think of Egypt and the plagues, and God demonstrating that he is the true God, and the Egyptian gods are idols. They're nothing. Okay, that's a very strong pattern across Scripture. Notice a strong pattern of how God views other perspectives on religion and truth. And here I would be glad for us to look at some of these passages just to appreciate the richness of this pattern. That in terms of other gods or other viewpoints, God is not tolerant at all. That God is not a God who gives everyone their chance or who accepts their worship to Baal or Astaroth. As long as they are sincere, he accepts it as worship to him. It's not that way. So I see passages like this. They have cast their gods into the fire, their gods have been cast into the fire because they were not gods at all. They were the work of men's hands, wood, stone. That's why they should be destroyed. All of the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord, Jehovah, made heaven and earth. May all who serve graven images be confounded. All other gods must worship him. He's the only true one. And I could keep on going. I mentioned Isaiah earlier. Here, I declare it even from the beginning, lest you would say, my idol hath done this. I'm going to tell you, I am the one who did this. Concerning the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice to idols, we know that an idol is nothing. It's emptiness. There is nothing to it. God has no agreement with idols. There is nothing in between his relationship towards them that is tolerant. And finally, Revelation will talk about the works of idols, specifically that they are worshiping devils. There's a theme I'd love to talk about here, and we'll do it later when we give a perspective of false religions. But the theme goes that idolatry and false religion is actually an expression of something demonic. Finally, there's a strong pattern across Scripture that Jesus and the gospel are exclusive. Meaning it's not just Jesus abiding together with others and you can choose your viewpoint or the one that fits your culture. But you have strong statements like this. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me, him only. There is no salvation in any other. There is no other name given among men whereby we must be saved. He is it. He's the only one. Whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And what follows is a set of questions that ultimately ends with, they cannot believe in the one that they have not heard. And in order to hear that, someone must go and preach. The notion of it goes that if you are going to have salvation, and if salvation is found only in Jesus, someone needs to declare the good news of Jesus. Salvation otherwise is impossible. That brings us then to talk about our last section, and that is how to speak to or how to address a pluralist or a postmodernist. You're having the conversation. What do you do? What kind of emphases will you give? Or what kind of concepts should you go for? So here, let me give you a couple of suggestions. First, recognize that the pluralist or the postmodern does not actually believe what they're claiming. In other words, they're claiming that they accept all viewpoints. But they don't actually think that. Because underneath the I believe all viewpoints, I accept them all, there's a deeper commitment, a deeper set of beliefs that they actually are committed to. And they think that they are correct. There are some things that even they must admit are wrong. They will. You might have to work to find those things, but those things exist. And one way to find those very quickly is to make an exclusivist statement. Well, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's either right or he's wrong. And they might come back with you with an answer like, well, that's your Western logic coming in. You're trying to give me either right or wrong, but we can just accept both. To which I'm saying, okay, you're apparently rejecting my Western logic. That means my Western logic is invalid. There are some things you don't accept after all. Even if what you don't accept is my Western logic, then you're telling me that's wrong. That tells me you don't accept all viewpoints. You see what I mean? You eventually come to something that everybody has to agree is right or wrong. In fact, it goes a little bit deeper than this. A postmodern will suggest that his view is more correct than mine. Statements like, let's think about some of the statements I gave earlier as examples. I gave an example, I'm suspicious of anything or anyone who is highly passionate about something. Right? Okay, that's a very postmodern or pluralist type statement. If you're very passionate about it, probably you're a little off. Okay? Well, that statement, do you believe that statement passionately? Or just kind of, maybe it's true, maybe it's not? See, if you turn the statement on itself, the statement is self-stultifying. It doesn't work. And I'll find myself, practically speaking, I'll ask questions like, with this kind of conversation, okay, let me give you an example. What if someone believes in polygamy, marrying girls that are basically children? And within his belief community, that's an acceptable thing. And he's married to like 4 little girls, and he calls them his wife. He calls those people his wives. Is that valid? Most people, even a very progressive postmodern, says, "Ooh, that's wrong." Do all religious pluralists really think that religions are the same? And when I have, again, this kind of conversation with someone says, well, we all have different viewpoints, but they're all valid in their own way. I'll ask something like, well, what about militant Islam? Okay, in this case, because we recognize within recent history, there have been multiple violent attacks that have happened, and people remember those. I recognize that there are also militant brands of Christianity and basically any faith. There are really nasty moments when people have been violent in the name of religion. Okay, do you believe that? Well, that person thinks that's his religion. In terms of jihad or a Muslim extremist, he really thinks that murdering people is serving Allah. Is that right or is that wrong? Almost everyone's going to say that's wrong. Okay, you don't accept everything. And what's going on here, religiously speaking, is that the person says they accept all religions and they accept all faiths as equally valid in their own way, but underneath it, they have an underlying faith. Their underlying faith is something like, we ought to be kind. We ought to be loving. Let's all understand each other. That's their religion. And then on top of that, then they're going to pretend to accept all of the different faiths. But the underlying religion is a different pre-existing commitment. So part of your process in talking to this person and trying to help them, it's not going to help just to try to attack and prove them wrong. What you want to go for in the conversation is figure out what is the underlying commitment. They're telling you, I accept all the religions. Okay, well, they don't. We know they don't. So you've just got to figure out what is the religion underneath the religions. What is the real religion that they are committed to? And whatever they believe in, or whatever they are proposing as the religion among the religions, there are standards for that religion. There are certain things in that religion, like what I said earlier, be kind, be a good person, be a good neighbor, that are the controlling ethics for that religion. So now we ask questions. How do you know that those standards or those canons are valid? And how do you prove them? Second line of discourse that you could have. Reality is none of us can really afford to pretend that all viewpoints are equally true. And just to support that, I would observe that none of us really care to go with postmodern standards if we're going to talk about a surgeon or an airplane pilot, because we all agree that if you're going to be a surgeon, there are certain things you should cut and other things you should not cut. And I don't want a surgeon going into my head with a viewpoint, well, I have my truth and you have your truth, and we'll just have a conversation. I want him to do it right. I want him to follow the right methods. And same thing with an airplane pilot. The ground is very merciless. I don't want him flying into the ground in the name of just having a conversation. I want him to fly the airplane correctly. And we recognize that there are ways to do it right and there are ways to do it wrong, and we have standards. The same thing in science. Science is very much not open to all kinds of multiple viewpoints. Scientifically, we agree that some of them are wrong. So question, why is religion suddenly and magically this one area where anything goes? I think it is because underneath it, people are not seriously taking religion seriously. Religion is kind of like a game we play. And I'm just going to respond to that to argue in the same way that something is scientifically there or it's not. The tree is in front of my face. I can't walk through the tree. I have to stop before I get to the tree. It's just there. The sun came up. It's just there. Why then would we say God is open to our interpretation? He's there or he's not. He is a certain way or he's not. He has spoken or he hasn't. The Bible is true and accurate or it's not. Jesus came and he is the Savior of the world, and he offers exclusive salvation or he doesn't. If we take the truth about God seriously, that also means that some other things are not true. And the only alternative to that is just to turn theology into the stories we tell ourselves to feel good. You know, I have a view that helps me, you have a view that helps you. No, I want to know what's true. Is there a God or is there not? When I die, will something happen or will it not? So from that then, what you're pushing to do as you have this conversation is you're trying to draw out the more basic commitments. And what I'll do is I'll just ask different questions. So someone says, I just accept all kinds of different gods. Okay. Well, what do you think? Is God good or evil? Do you think God is in control of the world, or is he just kind of hoping it'll work out? Has God provided salvation? Is there an eternity? Does everybody get to heaven, or are there only certain categories of people that get to heaven? Would we all just say, I'm going to be okay no matter what, so it doesn't matter what I do? Are there certain requirements for my behavior? Are there certain people, and this is a critical question, are there certain people that do deserve judgment and will not be in heaven? Because most people recognize there's somebody wicked enough that they think that person belongs in hell. And once you answer those questions, or once you draw those questions out, even if they say they accept all religions, whatever the answers they give you to those kinds of questions, that is their religion. What you've done is you've worked to try to expose what's actually the religion. And from there you move into deeper questions. What is the standard of authority for deciding what is true and what is not? How do we actually know that the things we talk about are true and real? How do we hear from God? How do we know if he has spoken to us or not? Is the Bible a good way to hear from God or not? You're getting into deeper questions about how to even establish that faith. And ultimately, of course, your final goal is to drive them to see that God has already spoken. He's spoken in his word. He's spoken truth. As you approach then a postmodern or a religious pluralist, it can be intimidating. And it can feel hopeless and impossible. It can feel like whatever you say, you give a certain proposition, they say, oh, I agree with that, but I agree with all kinds of viewpoints. Well, what about this? Oh yeah, well, I agree with that, and all kinds of viewpoints. It can feel like there is no answer. I would encourage us then, push through, find out what their actual commitment is. One of the many good ways to do that, bring up one of these universal and exclusive statements of Jesus Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And just ask, do you think that's true, or was he wrong there? Push through to find out what is their underlying religion. What do they actually commit to as their core? And from there then, using scripture, using truth, we have the opportunity to address that and to draw a person towards understanding the richness of what God has given us in his word. And I'll just conclude today by encouraging you to be grateful that God has not just given us shadowy stories. Here are a few ideas, and they might be true or they might not be true, and just let these stories help you feel better about your life. But God is every bit as much real and true as the fact that the sun rose. That should be obvious because he existed before there was a sun, and he's the reason that the sun did rise. And given and knowing a reality like that, a very real and very true God, be grateful that God has spoken. He has spoken authoritatively. He has spoken in a way that does not leave us with impossible questions. I observed earlier the sense that yes, our wisdom is limited. No one of us can know absolutely and completely and understand the world, but he does. And he has spoken. And as you and I then hear and respond to his word, we cannot know all truth for sure, but we can know sufficient truth because he has given us the guidance we need to have to walk with him, to be obedient to him, and to follow.